So, this week's episode of 48 Hours tells the story of Christy Wilson's 2005 disappearance. A man was convicted of her murder, but it took investigators 15 years to find her body. Erin Moriarty tells us how Wilson's mother has never given up on her daughter's case.
The footage is grainy, black and white, time-stamped 1:13 in the morning. A young woman in a light shirt walks beside an older man through a casino parking lot. Twice, he reaches for her, an arm around the shoulder, a hand toward her elbow, and twice, she pulls away. It is such a small gesture. A shrug, a half-step sideways, the kind of thing a person does a dozen times a day without thinking about it. Nobody watching a security monitor that night would have looked twice. But someone would look at this exact clip, frame by frame, for the next 15 years, because it was the last time anyone who loved her ever saw her move. Her name was Christy Wilson. She was 27 years old, and by the time anyone understood what that small, ordinary gesture actually meant, she had already been gone for hours. People who knew Christy describe her less by any single fact than by the feeling of being around her. Her best friend, a woman named Tiffany, had known her since they were girls in school together. Soul sisters, Tiffany calls them, the kind of friendship built on nothing more complicated than choosing each other, over and over, for years. Christy had a gift, Tiffany says, for making a bad day disappear. She pictures her still in the front room of some old apartment, dancing, laughing at nothing in particular, the sort of person whose presence alone could turn an ordinary evening into something worth remembering. No matter what we were going through, Tiffany has said, we always knew we were there for each other. On the evening of October 4th, 2005, Christy drove to Sacramento to collect the last of her belongings and spend time with her boyfriend, Danny Burlando. They had dinner with his family. Christy had picked up a habit of gambling recently, not out of recklessness, those who knew her would later say, but because she was between jobs and short on money, and she had a knack for blackjack, a quick mind for cards that had turned an occasional night out into something closer to routine. Danny worried about it, the way people worry about the small things right up until the moment the small things stop mattering at all. That night, she told him she was heading to Thunder Valley Casino, out past Lincoln in Placer County, to play a few hands. At 10:28 that night, her phone rang. It was Danny. He told her to come home. She told him she was finishing up, that she'd be there soon. It was an unremarkable conversation, the kind couples have 1,000 times without noticing, and neither of them knew it would be the last one they'd ever have. Inside the casino, Christy sat down at a blackjack table. She played for a while, drank a little, talked a little, the way regulars do. At some point the table went cold, the way tables do, and a man beside her, older, gray-templed, pleasant enough, suggested they try another table together. She said sure. His name was Mario Garcia. He was 53 years old, and until a few hours earlier, Christy Wilson had never heard of him in her life. At 1:13 in the morning on October 5th, a casino surveillance camera caught them walking out together into the parking lot. It is the video that would define this case for the next decade and a half. The video with the small, telling gesture in it. Garcia tries twice to close the distance between them. Twice, Christy moves away. Then the two of them walk on toward his car, and the camera loses them in the dark. 3 minutes and 41 seconds later, Garcia's car reappears on a different camera, pulling back into view. As far as anyone could tell, watching that tape, he was alone inside it. Nobody heard from Christy Wilson again. Not that night, not the next morning when Danny woke to an empty apartment and no explanation. Not that afternoon when his calls started going straight to voicemail. He left message after message, worried, then desperate. "It's been 24 hours since I talked to you last," one of them says, "and I'm worried sick about you. Please call me if you're okay. Call me if you're not okay. Just call me." She never did. Danny drove the 30 miles out to Thunder Valley himself and found her car still sitting in the lot, untouched, exactly where she'd left it. He had her paged over the casino intercom. No one came. He filed a missing persons report, and Detective Don Murchison, who took the case from the very beginning, found him cooperative in every way a person could be. Nothing about Danny raised a flag. The flag was already sitting somewhere else, on a strip of parking lot surveillance tape nobody outside the sheriff's office had seen yet. In the days that followed, hundreds of volunteers joined Placer County search and rescue teams to comb the rugged, oak-studded terrain around Auburn, a landscape of steep ravines, dry creek beds, and dense scrub that could swallow a person whole and never give her back. Christy's older sister, Stacy, was among the searchers. "You want to hear details," she has said, "but you don't. I just get this image in my head of God, what she must have been going through." Teams drove every road, every driveway, every cul-de-sac they could find. They found nothing. Whatever had happened to Christy Wilson, the ground around Auburn was not going to give it up easily. Investigators pulled Christy's file at the casino's player tracking system and matched it against everyone who'd used a card at her table that night. That was how they found him. Mario Flavio Garcia, 53, a project manager at a local hospital, married, 2 teenage sons, a home on roughly 5 acres out in the gold country hills of Auburn. On the surface, he looked like the least likely person in the world to have hurt anyone. He had coached his boys' sports teams. His wife, Jean, would later tell reporters he was a family man, that he came home every night, that they all sat down together at the table. His older son, Chris, called him a great dad. 4 days after Christy disappeared, investigators went out to that house on 5 acres to talk to him, and to run the kind of routine background check that gets run on anyone who becomes a person of interest in a missing woman's case. Garcia, by every account, was cooperative in that first interview, calm and unhurried, a man with nothing to hide. He told detectives he remembered gambling beside a young woman that night, but hadn't known her name. He said they'd left together, walked toward his car, and that somewhere in that walk she remembered she'd left her phone inside and turned back for it. He said he'd driven home alone, taken his usual route, and gone to bed. It was a clean, simple story, delivered without hesitation. What came back from the background check changed the entire shape of the investigation, though it would take detectives weeks, and a jury more than a year, to understand exactly how far back the shape of this case actually went. To understand why investigators reacted the way they did to that background check, you have to go back further than October of 2005. You have to go back almost 30 years, to 2 women whose names meant nothing to Christy Wilson, whose lives she never touched, and who nonetheless would end up standing, in their own separate ways, between Mario Garcia and the rest of his life. The first was Wendy Ward. She met Garcia in 1978, near Oakland, when she was 26 and he was 27. At first, she'd say later, he seemed intelligent, articulate, warm, the kind of man who made a person feel cared for. They started dating. And then, the way it so often goes, she began to see the temper underneath the warmth, and when she finally ended the relationship, that temper found her. One night, Garcia grabbed her and forced her into his van. He held her by the head and neck and told her that if she did anything at all, he would take her head and smash it. He told her to take off her clothes. When she refused, when she fought back, scratching and clawing at whatever she could reach, he began to choke her. She has said in the years since that she genuinely believed she was going to die in that van. He drove her back to his apartment. He pulled a gun from a cabinet, held it to her head, and pulled the trigger. It wasn't loaded. This time, he told her, almost conversationally, as though the threat itself was the point. He forced himself on her. And then, in a detail that has stayed with everyone who has ever heard this story, he got up, made himself a sandwich, ate it, and drove her home, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Wendy went straight to the hospital. Police arrested Garcia. But the case dragged on for 2 years before prosecutors finally offered him a deal, and Garcia, calculating, as he so often was, exactly how little he could get away with admitting, pleaded guilty to a single count of assault with a deadly weapon. He received probation, no prison time. He would later insist, decades on, that there had never been a gun at all, that Wendy's allegations weren't true, that theirs had simply been a stormy relationship. He pleaded guilty to assault with a deadly weapon. There had been no deadly weapon, he said, in the same breath. Wendy moved on with her life, as much as anyone can move on from something like that. She never forgot him. She just, for a long time, had no reason to think about him at all. The second woman was named Lynette Smith. She began dating Garcia in 1979, not long after his relationship with Wendy had ended so violently, and her brother Tom Davis remembers her as fun to be around. Outgoing, full of life. Their relationship, too, turned volatile. At one point, Lynette became pregnant with Garcia's child and chose to end the pregnancy, a decision that reportedly left Garcia furious. And yet, in the strange, contradictory way that abusive relationships so often continue, the two of them were still together that Christmas, still close enough that Lynette brought Garcia along to celebrate the holiday with her mother, Violet Davis. After dinner, the three of them got into Lynette's car. It was a clear night, the streets dry. Retired Oakland police accident investigator John Cave was the officer who responded when the call came in. A car in the water near the Oakland airport along the estuary. Witnesses said the car had pulled over onto the shoulder, and then, instead of driving on, it accelerated straight toward a low pier-like ledge at the water's edge, and went off the end of it into the bay. Garcia was the only one who survived. He told police he panicked, unbuckled himself, rolled down a window, and swam free. He said Lynette had been driving. Investigators could never confirm who was actually behind the wheel that night, and without that confirmation, without a way to prove intent, no charges were ever filed in the deaths of Lynette Smith and her mother. Cave wanted to question Garcia further. He never got the chance. Garcia hired a criminal defense lawyer the very next day, a strange move, one investigator would later observe dryly, for a man who claimed nothing more than a tragic accident had occurred. It's not a very efficient way to get rid of somebody, is it? That investigator said, decades later, still turning the case over in his mind. But it worked, didn't it? And if he was the driver, he got away with it. For a quarter of a century, these two stories, a woman who survived Mario Garcia and a woman who did not, sat separately, unconnected, buried in old case files that nobody had any reason to reopen. Then, one day, an old friend called Wendy Ward, and everything came back at once. The friend was Tom Davis, Lynette's brother, someone Wendy had known from her hometown years before. As they talked, catching up, Wendy asked how his sister was doing. He told her Lynette had died, years earlier, in a car accident, with a man named Mario Garcia. Wendy went cold. "It goes beyond disbelief," she would say later. "I used to date him. I brought charges against him for what he did to me." And here was Lynette's own brother, telling her the same name, the same man, connected now to a death instead of an assault, decades after the fact, and with no charges ever filed for either. That reconnection sat in the past for a while longer, an old, terrible coincidence with nowhere to go. And then, in October of 2005, Wendy heard a piece of news that made her stomach drop all over again. A young woman named Christy Wilson had vanished after a night at a casino, and the last person seen with her was a man named Mario Garcia. "I felt sick to my stomach," she said. It didn't take long for Detective Don Murchison, running that same background check, to track her down. When he did, Wendy told him everything: the van, the threat, the sandwich, the plea deal, and Lynette Smith's name besides. "I felt," she told him, "that after my own incident with him, he could very easily do this again with someone else." She had been right for 26 years. Now, finally, someone was listening. For weeks after Christy vanished, Placer County authorities mounted an enormous search across the rugged terrain around Auburn. Search and rescue teams, volunteers driving every road and cul-de-sac in the county, helicopters overhead. They found nothing. Cadaver dogs walked the length and breadth of Garcia's 5 acres and alerted on nothing at all. At one particularly grim low point, investigators pumped out and hand-searched an entire septic tank on the property, 2,000 gallons of it, looking for any trace of her. Nothing. What they did have was Garcia's car. A warrant let them search it, and inside they found a single pulled hair in the trunk that matched Christie's, along with traces of blood on the back seat and the door, later confirmed as hers. Garcia would claim, when confronted with it, that he had simply cleaned the car, wiped away every trace of his wife, his sons, anyone else who had ever ridden in it. Every trace, he said, except Christy Wilson's. It was, even to a jury inclined to be skeptical of coincidence, a difficult thing to explain away. There was more. The morning after that night at the casino, several of Garcia's co-workers noticed scratches on his face. He later visited an eye doctor. He would tell investigators the marks came from poison oak or from falling out of a tree. The story shifted depending on who was asking. But an emergency room physician named Robert Royer had been sitting at that same blackjack table, close enough to Garcia, less than a meter away, close enough to notice. And Royer told investigators plainly that he saw no injuries on Garcia's face that night at all. It was his job, he said, to notice exactly this kind of thing. And a week after Christy disappeared, Garcia sat down at a computer and searched for information on how authorities test for drugs used to incapacitate someone, a detail the prosecution would later use to devastating effect. 3 weeks after Christy Wilson vanished, with no body, no confession, and a mounting case built almost entirely on inference and physical trace evidence, Placer County prosecutors made a decision the county had never made before. They charged Mario Garcia with murder anyway. It was, at the time, an enormous gamble. Deputy District Attorney Garen Horst would carry the case to trial, knowing that convicting someone of murder without a body, without so much as a single confirmed piece of Christy Wilson's remains, was almost unheard of. No body prosecutions succeed far less often than they fail. Juries, understandably, tend to want a body. Horst didn't have one. What he had instead was a video of a woman pulling her arm away from a man twice in a dark parking lot, a trunk with her hair in it, biological traces that shouldn't have been there, and a man who had already left 2 other women behind him, one who lived and one who didn't. The trial opened on September 11, 2006, in Placer County Superior Court, presided over by Judge Larry Gaddis. It ran for nearly 2 months and called 90 witnesses to the stand, an extraordinary undertaking for any homicide case, let alone one with no body at its center. The jury never heard about Wendy Ward or Lynette Smith during that phase of the trial. That history would be saved and would matter enormously for what came after a verdict. What the jury heard instead was the physical case, laid out piece by piece. The hair, the blood, the scratches nobody else saw, the search for information on incapacitating drugs, and the video. Always, again and again, the video, with its two small, unmistakable gestures of a young woman pulling away from a man who would not let go. Garcia's own account of that night, given first to detectives and repeated to the jury, never changed in its broad strokes. He said the table had gone cold, that Christy had asked him to move with her to another, that they had walked out together and made it as far as his car before she remembered she'd left her cell phone inside. He said they embraced, that she turned back for the casino, and that he drove home alone. It was a story built to explain away the one thing the video actually showed, the two of them walking toward his car together, and only one of them, as far as any camera could confirm, ever walking back. The prosecution's answer to that story was patient and relentless. Investigators had gone back to the casino and pulled every available frame of surveillance, and nowhere in any of it was there footage of Christy re-entering the building, retrieving a phone, or walking anywhere at all after that dark stretch of parking lot swallowed her. Her phone itself was eventually found still inside the casino, but there was no record of her ever returning for it. Deputy District Attorney Garen Horst built the state's closing argument around a single, simple proposition. Somewhere between the edge of that camera's view and the reappearance of Garcia's car 3 minutes and 41 seconds later, Christy Wilson had been put in the back seat of that car, and she had never gotten out of it alive. He pointed to the traces on the seat and the door, to the single hair in the trunk, and asked the jury the question that had shaped the entire case from the beginning. Why was Christy Wilson's DNA the only DNA in that car, when Garcia himself admitted to having cleaned out every other trace, his wife's, his son's, anyone else who had ever ridden in it, except hers? Garcia took the stand in his own defense. He denied everything, calmly, evenly, the same way he had denied it from the very first interview. "I wanted to tell the court that I am very sorry that Christy Wilson is missing," he told the jury, "but I don't know where she's at." His attorney argued there simply wasn't enough evidence, that without a body, no one could even prove Christy was dead at all, let alone that Garcia was responsible for it. In his closing, the defense reminded jurors that absence is not proof, that a missing woman is not automatically a murdered one, and that the state was asking them to convict a man of homicide without so much as a fingernail of physical remains to show for it. The jury did not agree. They found Mario Garcia guilty of first-degree murder and guilty of possessing an illegal weapon, a collapsible baton that had turned up in his car during the search. It was, prosecutors would later say, as plain as the scratches that had once been on his face and were somehow gone by the time anyone official came to look for them. At his sentencing hearing on January 11, 2007, Christy's mother, a woman named Debbie Boyd, who would spend the next 15 years of her life refusing to let this case go cold, held out one last hope. Perhaps, in exchange for some measure of leniency, Garcia would finally tell them where her daughter's body was. He did not. "I suppose that at this hearing I'm supposed to ask for mercy," he told the court, "for forgiveness and to show remorse. However, I will not do such a thing. I did not kill Christy Wilson. I am innocent." It was now, with the guilt phase behind them, that Wendy Ward's history and Lynette Smith's death entered the record as aggravating factors. The judge doubled Garcia's sentence because of his prior violent felony against Wendy and added further enhancements on top of that. His aggregate sentence came to 59 years to life. The women he had hurt, one of them fatally, a quarter-century earlier had, in the end, helped put him away for a crime he still refused to admit to. Garcia would spend years fighting the verdict from inside a prison cell. In February of 2009, California's 3rd District Court of Appeal affirmed his conviction, ruling, even while acknowledging a narrow constitutional error in how one piece of evidence had been admitted, that the case against him had been, in the court's own words, powerful and overwhelming. He petitioned the state Supreme Court for review. It was denied that June. Every legal door had now closed. What remained open, the only thing that had ever really remained open, was the question of where Christy Wilson actually was. That question would not be answered for another 11 years. Debbie Boyd, 5'1", blonde, and by her own description something considerably tougher than she looked, had promised early on that Garcia had met a barracuda and that the fight was on. She meant it literally, in ways that stretched across more than a decade. Investigators Nuno Tavares and Don Murchison, the same detective who had first taken Danny's missing persons report all those years earlier, stayed on the case long after Garcia went to prison, with the full backing of Placer County District Attorney Morgan Geyer. They kept searching. They kept following leads that mostly went nowhere. The appeals kept coming, kept threatening to unravel a conviction that had never come with the one thing that might have made it feel finished: Christy's actual return. It was not a passive kind of waiting. Every appeal Garcia filed pulled Debbie back into the case, forced her to relive it in some new procedural form, even as she and Pat tried to build a life that wasn't entirely consumed by it. Pat Boyd, a former San Jose detective himself, understood better than most what was at stake in each of those filings, how a single lost motion, a single overturned ruling, could unravel a decade and a half of work in an afternoon. "It's not like we had a tremendous amount of evidence," he has said. "A small amount of evidence being lost, the case would have been lost. You can't move forward completely when you have all these appeals. It's like you move forward 5 steps, and then you're back in it again." But for Tavares and Murchison, the uncertainty of the appeals was never allowed to become a distraction from the actual physical mission that mattered more than any of it: finding Christy and bringing her home. In 2017, a Sacramento television reporter named Tony Lopez sat down with Debbie for an interview, and Debbie, after more than a decade of anger she had more than earned, said something unexpected. "I now view him as a lost soul," she said, "of the man responsible for her daughter's death. I often wonder how he ever became the man that he did. If Mario were to pass away with me, not having had the opportunity to sit and just talk to him, I know I would forever regret it." Garcia saw that interview. He began writing letters to Debbie and to officials in Placer County. He apologized in a fashion for what Debbie had suffered. He never once accepted responsibility for having caused it. And according to Debbie, his letters hinted at something else entirely: that he might be willing to trade the location of her daughter's remains for a chance at an earlier release. For a while, Debbie considered it. She had struggled for years with a question that had no good answer. What do you negotiate with a man convicted in her daughter's death, who alone knows where she is? In the end, she decided she couldn't do it. "He will not use my daughter's body as a bargaining chip," she said. "There would be no deal. If Christy was ever coming home, it would not be because her mother had traded for it. It would happen instead because of a soccer game." Garcia's son, Chris, had grown up on that 5-acre property in Auburn, and in the years after his father's conviction, he found himself thinking back to one particular Saturday in October of 2005, days after Christy Wilson vanished, before police had ever come to question his father. Chris had an important soccer game that day. He remembered finding his father out near their detached garage, working the ground with a tractor. Working, Chris would later say, almost frantically, with what he described as a crazed look in his eyes. When Chris told him it was time to go, his father said no. Firmly. "I'm not going." It was completely unlike him. His father never missed his son's games. Chris came forward with that memory, and investigators, Tavares and Murchison, still on the case, still not letting go, asked him to walk them back to the old property, which the Garcia family had lost in 2007, to point out exactly where he'd seen his father working that day. It was barely 100 yards from the house, right along the road, in ground that had since been landscaped over so cleanly, so thoroughly, that it simply disappeared into the rest of the yard. Cadaver dogs had walked directly over that spot back in 2005 and found nothing at all. Garcia, it turned out, had 4 or 5 days before anyone came looking, more than enough time to do the job right. In August of 2020, nearly a decade and a half after Christy disappeared, Tavares and Murchison brought in a company specializing in ground-penetrating radar and scanned almost the entirety of the former Garcia property, acre by acre, with the cooperation of the new owners who now lived where Garcia's family once had. It was slow, methodical work, nothing like the frantic wide-net searches of 2005, all helicopters and volunteers combing open ground. This was quiet, deliberate, almost surgical. The technology found 8 separate spots where the ground concealed some kind of void or pocket beneath the surface, each one a possibility, each one a fresh chance at disappointment. The first 2 turned up nothing. "You've struck out twice," someone on the team observed, half a joke worn thin by 14 years of exactly that kind of luck. "It's my favorite hole," Murchison would say of the third, because that's exactly where Chris had described his father frantically working that day, all those years ago, with a tractor he had no business needing. They began pulling back the soil, inch by careful inch, roughly 25 feet in one direction, 18 feet in the other. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Murchison saw it. A bone, rising up out of the ground. "I was a little bit short of breath, I'll tell you that," he said afterward. "The blood was rushing, and we stopped everything. We froze." It was, as he put it, the moment of truth. After everything, after 15 years, after every dead end, and every hand-searched septic tank, and every cadaver dog that had walked straight over this exact spot without so much as a pause. This was it, or it wasn't. There was no way, yet, to know which. Everything stopped. An archaeologist named Cindy Arrington was called to the scene to confirm what they were looking at. She told them immediately it was human. Murchison, still not quite able to believe it after all those years of dead ends, asked her to get closer, to double-check, to triple-check. She climbed down into the trench herself. "Yes," she told him, "it's human." It would take a little longer to be certain it was Christy. But by the next morning, before Debbie had even left for the airport to fly out and tell her other daughter in person, word came back. Investigators had recovered nearly an entire skeleton, and dental records confirmed what everyone by then already suspected. It was her. After 15 years, Christy Wilson had been found. There is a detail from that notification that says as much about this case as any piece of forensic evidence ever could. Years earlier, Debbie and Wendy Ward, the 2 women whose lives Mario Garcia had tried, in his own way, to destroy, had started teaching a class together for homicide investigators, sharing what it meant to live on the other side of a case like this one. Only 2 months before the remains were found, someone in that class had asked Debbie a question no one had ever thought to ask her before. "If your daughter is ever recovered, how would you want to be told?" "Please," she'd said, "don't ever just call me on the phone." So Nuno Tavares and Don Murchison flew out to Scottsdale, Arizona, where the Boyds were living by then, and arrived at their door close to midnight, the exact opposite of the phone call Debbie had asked never to receive, delivered in person by the 2 men who had never let this case go. Pat Boyd, Christy's stepfather, opened it, smiling, the way you do for old friends. Debbie was asleep on the couch, and then Pat saw their faces, and the smile started to change, and he understood before either of them said a word. Debbie remembers standing up in a fog, looking at the 2 men in her doorway, asking what on earth they were doing there. And then they told her, Human remains had been found on Mario Garcia's old property. They believed it was Christy. They couldn't yet be certain. "I remember her that night saying, 'Is it okay to be happy?'" one of them recalled, Debbie looking around the room, almost apologetically, as if joy after 15 years of grief needed permission. There was no champagne that night, just hugs and long stretches of quiet, and the strange work of letting something this large finally sink in. An autopsy would later reveal evidence of significant physical trauma prior to her passing, confirming to investigators that she had fought back against her attacker. Some questions, even after 15 years and a returned body, never fully close. In October of 2020, on the anniversary of the night she disappeared, Christy's remains were cremated. Her mother and her father, Dennis, traveled together to a pier in the beach town of Capitola, California, a place Christy had once called her happy place, where the family had placed a small memorial plaque years earlier, long before there was ever a body to properly grieve. Debbie has said that finally knowing, after everything, changed the entire shape of her grief. "We can grieve the way that we should have been able to grieve 15 years ago," she said. "There's a peace about that. I was so blessed to be her mom for 27 years, and that I will carry with me forever." 2 months after Christy came home, on Christmas Eve of 2020, Mario Garcia died in his prison cell of pneumonia. He was 68 years old. He had spent nearly 14 years behind bars, and every single one of them insisting, to the very last, that he was not responsible for Christy Wilson's death, that he was innocent of the one crime that had defined the second half of his life, the same denial he had given the court in 2007, unchanged. Whatever peace his family found in his final days, whatever quiet conversations passed between Debbie's carefully chosen words in 2017 and his death 3 years later, the record shows a man who never once said her name and meant "I did it." Debbie Boyd, when she heard, said only that her family was at tremendous peace. For everyone this case had touched, in ways large and small, that peace came differently and came slowly. Danny Burlando, Christy's boyfriend, had spent a decade and a half feeling, in his own words, judged, misjudged, misunderstood, carrying a grief he was never quite allowed to have, because for a long time he had also been a suspect in the disappearance of a woman he loved. Only now could he finally begin to grieve like what he had always actually been, a victim of Mario Garcia, too. Wendy Ward flew to Sacramento not long after the remains were found and met Debbie Boyd in person for the first time in her life. 2 women who had spent decades fighting the same man from opposite directions, one trying to convict him for what he did to her, the other trying to find out what he'd done to her daughter. "I couldn't stop hugging her," Wendy said. "She has spoken since about turning what happened to her into art, about needing, finally, to create something, rather than simply carry the weight of it. What came up in me," she said, "to survive, and to say no more." Garcia's ex-wife Jean, who divorced him after the conviction, and his sons Chris and Andy, chose not to speak publicly when the remains were found. They didn't ask, one investigator would later say, for a father and a husband responsible for a killing, who buried his victim in the ground where they lived and played as children, without ever knowing it was there. It is one of the quieter cruelties of this case that Chris, who as a teenager gave detectives the one memory that finally cracked it open, had spent his childhood playing in a yard that concealed the truth about his own father the entire time. Whatever grief or relief the family carried, they carried it privately, and largely out of view of the cameras that had followed every other part of this story for so long. Investigator Nuno Tavares, who went on to build a career training a new generation of homicide detectives, still returns to this case when he teaches. Persistence, he tells his students, is not a virtue you get to feel good about in the moment. It is a discipline you practice for years without knowing whether it will ever pay off. And then, if you're fortunate, and if a family never gives up asking, it does. And somewhere in Sacramento, Christy's best friend Tiffany still hears a certain song on the radio, or catches a certain way of moving, and thinks of a girl who used to dance in her living room and make even the worst days feel lighter. She's never been completely gone, Tiffany has said. I've been carrying her spirit with me every day. It is worth returning in the end to that single piece of grainy footage, the one thing every person connected to this case eventually watched and rewatched and could never quite stop watching. A young woman in a parking lot at 1:13 in the morning, pulling her arm away from a man twice, in the last seconds anyone who loved her would ever see her alive. For 15 years, that gesture was the only voice Christy Wilson had in her own case. A woman's clear, wordless refusal, caught on a security camera nobody thought to look at twice until it was already too late. It took a jury, and then it took a soccer game, and a son's memory, and 2 other women's decades-old suffering finally being believed, before the rest of the world caught up to what that small movement had been trying to say all along. She didn't want to go with him, and in the end, after everything, she came home anyway.